everyone, it's Kira and welcome back to another monthly reading wrap up. Today we're going to be talking about the very small pile of books that I actually managed to read in February. Now I think partially that comes down to the fact that February is of course a slightly smaller month, so a few less days for reading, and second of all it was a very busy month at work. So busy in fact I can't believe that February has actually been and gone because it went so quickly and was so incredibly busy, and then partially just because of some of the books that I ended up reading not quite taking my fancy as much as I'd expected and kind of slowing down my reading pace. So with all that in mind, in February I managed to read a total of 3 books, which is probably up there as one of the lowest reading months of my entire life, so at least there's that. But on the whole, it was a month of reading. I read 3 books, let's talk about them. Before we do, I have of course got myself a lovely cup of tea and I would invite you to do the same, and I'd also love if you could let me know in the comments down below how your month of reading went. Fingers crossed it went better than mine, but if not, know that I'm here with you in solidarity because bad reading months happen and we just have to pack up and move on to the next month and hope that it will be better. So that's what I'm hoping for March, but for now let's look back on February and dive into the 3 books that I did manage to read. The month actually did start well because I kicked off the month with Persuasion by Jane Austen. First of all, I love this cover. This is a vintage classic edition and I currently have this Mansfield Park and also Northanger Abbey in this like a design cover edition, and I just think that they are so cute and just like really simple but also so beautiful, and it is definitely my intention to get the other 3 books in her like novel series. It's not really a series, but in her collection of novels in this cover design as well because I just think that they're so gorgeous. They don't, in fact, let's just take a moment to appreciate them because I for one love these covers. So this is obviously Persuasion. It has this beautiful like black and white flowery design, then on the inside it has like a green pattern print, and the books all tie together in this way so they don't match on the outside but they all sort of bring themselves together by having inside covers that match the exterior of other books. So that is Persuasion. Then we have Northanger Abbey, which I think is my favourite because I just love this like again black and white design with like little trees. It just looks so handmade but so beautiful. Then the inside of this one has an orangey print design, which I believe is the outside cover of the Emma of this collection. And then finally we have Mansfield Park, which has the green cover that is on the inside of Persuasion, and then inside this one it ties back to Persuasion with that black and white flower design. So I just think these are so simple and yet really beautiful, and they just look so gorgeous on my shelves. So first of all, shout out to these books for being so gorgeous, but second of all, shout out to Jane Austen for being such an absolute icon because she has made the last 6 months of reading so much fun. And the reason why Persuasion felt like such a great way to start my reading month in February was because it brought my Jane Austen classic read along to an end. So for the, I suppose 7 months, because I did kind of extend it slightly, but essentially for 6 months starting around August and going through to the end of January / beginning of February, I was reading each of Jane Austen's novels in publication order, one every month, and Persuasion was her last published novel and of course brought that read along to an end. But it was such a fun reading experience for me, and I'm so glad that so many of you guys were able to join in as well. Persuasion was for me a reread. I had read this book for the very first time when I was in my 2nd year of university, I believe, so that would be going back a fair few years now, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, and so I definitely enjoyed it at the time of reading it, and I also thought it was a great book to study in the module that I was reading it for. But equally, reading a book for the purpose of studying it, writing essays about it, analysing it in great detail is never quite the same, or at least in my experience quite as enjoyable as reading a book purely for pleasure, because you are having to read so much further into it and analyse it from many different perspectives other than just plot and enjoyment. And so while I remember enjoying Persuasion, I also had, I guess, a slightly clouded experience of it that was guided by the fact that I had read it academically my first time around. So I was really looking forward to going into this book with like kind of fresh eyes and going in with the idea of just like taking it in as a whole new experience, because while I was familiar with the plot, reading it for pleasure pleasure this time rather than for the purpose of studying meant that I was going in and having a completely different reading experience this time around, and so I was really excited about it and did really enjoy this, as I have really enjoyed all of Jane Austen's novels. Now I will say that Persuasion sits towards the bottom end of my Jane Austen ranking, but that is a ranking that is like very much like prefaced by the fact that all of her books are great, and so while some I prefer to others, they're all really, really wonderful reading experiences. For anyone that isn't familiar with Persuasion, I would say that this is the most unique of Jane Austen's novels, in the sense that we focus on a much older protagonist. Now, much older in the context of it being written in the 1800s, might I add, because the main character in this novel is, I believe, 27 years old. So in the grand scheme of life in the modern world, very, very young still, and still very much in the prime of her life, but in the context of when the book was written, she is someone who is kind of past her prime and is basically considered a spinster. And so this stands out a lot to me compared to Jane Austen's other novels, because generally speaking, we're following someone who is either a teenager or a very young 20s woman who is kind of like out in society for the first time, and marriage is like on the brain basically, because that is what society was like at this time. Whereas the main character in this novel, Anne Elliot, is kind of portrayed as a bit of a wallflower. She was beautiful in her youth but had an engagement that kind of went wrong, which is what the book really focuses on, and then went into adulthood just kind of on the fringes of society, respectable but not really looking for romance and not really sort of like putting herself out there. And so she feels very, very different from any of Jane Austen's other protagonists, because she isn't sort of like seeking a marital partner, and she is also just at a completely different stage in her life, so any romance that does crop up just feels quite different, I suppose is the only way I can phrase it. And I think the thing that I really sort of like enjoyed about this book was the very beginning and the introduction to Anne as a protagonist, because I think the way that Jane Austen introduces her characters is always really clever. And in this novel, she actually introduces Anne from a second point of view. So instead of just telling us about Anne as a protagonist, she actually talks about Anne's dad, who is a very like self-centered, like gregarious, and just like a very like unappealing man basically, and he has his eldest daughter Elizabeth, I believe she's called. I might have just completely made that up now. I think it is, but you know there's so many Elizabeths in this time of Elizabeth, sorry. You know there's just so many people called Elizabeth that you just want to double check that you're not making one up. So yeah, Walter Elliot is Anne's father, and then he has his eldest daughter Elizabeth, who he thinks is absolutely wonderful. She is his favourite without a doubt. His wife is dead, and then they also have a younger sister who I believe is called Mary, but again, there are lots of Marys in Jane Austen novels, so maybe making that up too. And Mary is already married off, so he's not that interested in her, but at least she's gotten married. And we are introduced to Walter Elliot as a character who is basically obsessed with his own life and status, and then we eventually find out about Anne through the fact that she is one of his children, although he doesn't really care about her that much, and so she's kind of like a secondary introduction into the book. And for me, I thought that was such a clever way to introduce her and her standing in society, because she is such a background character and allows herself to be such, and I think that was just a really clever way to sort of like bring us into the narrative and give us a really clear understanding of where she sits in both like social circles and also in the dynamic of her own family unit, and that just gives you a really clear an interesting insight into who she is as a character before you've even actually met her, which I just thought was so clever. Now of course Jane Austen's novels are all about romance, and this is a novel all about sort of like lost love essentially. So as I mentioned, Anne was once engaged to a man. This was when she was young and beautiful, but she was basically talked into calling it off because people didn't think that he was worthy of her, as like her status and his status were quite different at the time, and she was basically talked into cutting off the engagement because it wasn't a good match. Now this is where Anne's life kind of like crumbles, because she has lost her love and she doesn't really put herself out there after this point. And then in adulthood, when she is 27, circles kind of like mix around, and she ends up coming back into contact with this man that she was once engaged to, who is now extremely successful, and she of course is like devastated, not not because of his success, because she wasn't particularly like a judgmental person, but more so just in the fact that she allowed herself to be persuaded to go down the wrong path in her opinion. So it's a really interesting novel. It's not about like a fresh new romance. I think the lost love theme feels very fresh and different compared to Jane Austen's other novels, and it is a really interesting one. I think you can really get invested in Anne as a character. The only critique of this book that I would say makes it a little bit of a more difficult read is that there are quite a lot of different social circles going on. Characters move in lots of different places in this book, and we have lots of different groups of people sort of interacting like separately and then intersecting later on in the book, and I think it feels quite busy, which means that you don't necessarily get as much time focused on the romance as at least I would have liked. I think there's a lot to have been done with that lost love and the previous engagement that is kind of a missed opportunity. So that is kind of the only unsatisfying thing about this book, is I think that there is too much time focused on insignificant characters and not enough on the parts that you would really want to get to know. But on the whole, it was a really, really lovely reading experience. I enjoyed it, as I have enjoyed all of Jane Austen's books, and it was just so fun to have finally finished off my Jane Austen read-along, because I've been wanting to do one for such a long time, and now I have. So how wonderful is that? And it was a great start to my month in February, which is good because the rest of the month was a bit iffy. I feel like I needed a big old gulp of tea after that Jane Austen monologue. But moving on to the second book that I picked up in February, which was without a doubt the big disappointment of the reading month, and the part where my month kind of halted with absolute devastation, because this was a book that I was really expecting to love and was also expecting to be a really, really quick read, and it just wasn't. And I can't believe it now that I'm saying it, because I usually love this author so much. But essentially I picked up this novel around the same time as I picked up Persuasion, because I was hoping to do a pre-Valentine's Day like romancy kind of read along, where I was going to read the classic romance that was Persuasion, and then a more modern day romance which was going to be The Christmas Bookshop by Jenny Colgan. Now I know that it is no longer Christmas time, but Jenny Colgan's books, quite a few of them are set at Christmas, and those are some of my favourites of her books, like The Christmas Island and Christmas at the Island Hotel, and I just think those books are so cosy. And while they're set at Christmas time, Christmas very rarely sort of makes up the primary part of the novel, and instead it's just about like community and coming together, and then a little bit of Christmas sprinkled in, but I don't think they are like specific to having to be read at Christmas time, if that makes sense. So that is why I decided to pick it up during Valentine's Day, but I just did not enjoy this book at all. I was so disappointed by it. Now, while romance does play a part in this book, as it does in pretty much all of Jenny Colgan's, this one actually starts as a book that focuses on the relationship between two sisters. We have our main character Carmen, who is kind of a bit of a disaster, and she's reached a bit of a low point in her life. She's lost a job, she didn't go to university, she doesn't really have any prospects, and she's kind of like lost and doesn't know what to do, but equally doesn't feel that motivated to get anything sorted. And on the other end of the spectrum entirely, we have her older sister Sophia, who is a complete success. She has 3 children already, she's pregnant with a 4th child, she is a high-flying lawyer in a happy marriage with a big house, a nanny, and basically like living life in the upper echelons of society, feeling very successful and very smug. And for that reason, her and Carmen don't seem to really get on, because Sophia kind of wants to fix Carmen's life up all of the time. Meanwhile, Carmen looks at Sophia as everything that she like hasn't achieved, and feels constantly wary of being judged by someone who is more successful than herself. But having lost her job, Sophia is able to find Carmen a temporary job working in an Edinburgh bookshop that is one of the clients that Sophia is a lawyer for, and essentially this is a crumbling, failing old bookshop run by an old man who has no business acumen, and it is basically Carmen's job to bring it up to scratch, because otherwise it's going to go under. And so those are all the ingredients of what I think would make an incredibly fun, cosy, wholesome, messy, chaotic, but really wonderful book. And yet the like concept being so good just meant that the reality fell a little bit flat for me, and while all of the like pieces are there to make a book that I would enjoy, I just didn't enjoy the execution of this novel in particular. I did enjoy the back and forth dynamic and gradual like thawing, god that's a weird word, thawing, the gradual thawing of the relationship between these two sisters, which had gotten very, very frosty. And I really did like that bit of the book. I thought it was like a very nice like element to sort of track throughout. But the rest of the book and the characters, I just felt very like characters. And I like books where you can really get lost in the novel and feel like you are invested in real people's lives kind of unfolding. And this book just felt very like two-dimensional for me, quite predictable, but not even predictable in the way where I was like rooting for the characters to reach a certain outcome. It just felt very dull, predictable, but not in a good way. And essentially I just didn't like this character, or these characters rather, and I just felt like the book fell flat. It wasn't magical in the way that I was expecting or anticipating, and I just felt highly disappointed and underwhelmed by this book, which really does make me so sad to say, because I was expecting another fluffy favourite to add to my romance shelves. So yeah, disappointing, but it can't be helped. It does happen sometimes, but I was just, yeah, quite devastated by this outcome, to be honest. However, we do not end February on a low note. Thankfully, the next book that I picked up ended up being a really, really fun read, and that was Someday, Someday Maybe by Lauren Graham. Now, as we all know, or at least as I know, Lauren Graham plays Lorelai Gilmore in Gilmore Girls, which is probably one of my favourite TV shows of all time. Don't even know why I said probably, because there's no probably about it. It is one of my favourite TV shows of all time, and I just think it is wonderful, and it's just great. If you haven't watched it, definitely do. But Lauren Graham is of course an actress, but she has also written a couple of books. Now, I have listened to her memoir before, which is called Talking as Fast as I Can, and as a memoir it obviously dives into her own experiences and largely looks at her, like, I guess, career journey, looking at when she was like a young, struggling actress trying to find jobs and not knowing where life was going to go, all the way up until finding success in Gilmore Girls, and then later on the revival of the series and what that kind of meant to her and the other actors in the show. So it was a really, really interesting memoir, and I loved sort of seeing that trajectory of her career. And then this is her only fiction novel, but it happens to be very, very similar in fact to her memoir. So I do feel like this is probably at least somewhat autobiographical, just having noticed a lot of similarities between the two novels and the two like sort of themes that are discussed in both books. And what I mean by that is that this book focuses on a main character called Franny, who is living in New York City and is an aspiring actress. She set herself a 3-year deadline to basically make it, or she was going to quit, move home and figure out what to do with her life not being an actress, and she is approaching the end of that 3-year deadline as this book begins. And so it did feel very like connected to Lauren's own story, sort of like that experience of putting yourself out there over and over again, the experience of going to all of these dead-end jobs, feeling like you're kind of selling your soul to the advertising world, meanwhile you really want to be acting in something serious, and just not knowing when you're going to get your break, but equally not feeling like you can quit because you never know, your big break might be just around the corner, and if you quit then someone else will get that break and you might never really reach that success. And I just think it was so fun to follow along with. It was a very unique book in my opinion, because as I mentioned in the vlog that I talked about this book in, if you've seen that, it kind of felt like a sitcom brought to life in book format, which felt very unique to me, because while I have read lots of books that could be deemed like romantic comedies, I've never read a sitcom style novel. I don't know if other books like this exist, but that is just the only way I could think to describe it. It really did feel like you were like logging in and watching like a classic 90s New York setting sitcom. I don't know if that felt very fresh in my mind because I'm also currently watching Seinfeld, which is another 90s New York sitcom, but equally there is of course things like Friends. I mean, there's a multitude of different sitcoms set in the New York setting that were brought out in the 90s, and this book is also set in the 90s, I should mention. So it had a very nostalgic feeling to it, sort of feeling like a lot of TV shows that felt very familiar, but I've never seen a book do that before. I feel like sitcoms, you know, typically are television based, and so to see something that felt sitcom-esque in the form of a book, it just felt very fresh and fun and really easy to follow. There were elements of romance in it, but it didn't feel like romance was the only goal of the novel, and while I am a big fan of romances, it also felt nice to have a book that did something slightly different in that respect and just focused on a character, their daily struggles and their like ambition and journey towards success, rather than just being focused on romantic pursuits. And so I really enjoyed it. I thought it had a really great blend of grit and humour, and I for one loved it. I do think that it felt very relatable. Although the book focuses on someone's journey to becoming an actress, I personally felt like you could relate to it as someone in your 20s, or looking back on your 20s if you are at a later point in your life, sort of remembering that early point of your career where you have so much ambition but no real way to make all of your dreams a reality, and sort of that struggle to climb the ladder in whatever industry you are in. And of course, if you are an actress or an actor, you probably can relate to this on a much more like deep and like direct level. I also think that it's something that everyone can relate to, just in that sense of like having to sort of work through the struggle to get to where you want to go. And for that reason, I thought it was a book that would be appealing to lots of people, because you can really get invested in the character. It feels like an underdog story, but there's a lot of fun in it as well, and I just really enjoyed it. So this has been on my shelves for years at this point, and I don't know why I'd never picked it up, but something inspired me to this last couple of weeks, and I'm so glad that I did, because I really enjoyed it, and now I have read both of Lauren Graham's books, which is always nice to say. So there we have it. Short and sweet, like the month itself. February was a 3-book month, and I'm just going to own it. It is what it is, and hopefully March will be better. As I mentioned, solidarity if you were not having a good reading month as well, and if you were, kudos to you. I'm glad that you enjoyed your month of reading in February. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.